Hello, how are y'all doing? Recently, I built this arch castle entrance sort of thing. I got the idea from this picture I found. Not that many builders talk about how they use reference for their builds, so I thought I would use this build to help demonstrate how I use reference to help me when I'm building. Most of the builders I've talked to use reference in some way when they're building. Some people use it to help them with the shape of the build, and some people use it to help them with the palette. Most of the time, I won't start a build using one specific reference in particular. This helps me to get something a bit more original going. But a lot of people use just one picture, like I'm doing here. Using just one reference helps you go for a bit more of a realistic style. I find that it helps you get the colors and the proportions down a bit better. I really liked this picture though because a lot of the building's in shadow. This way the picture only really helps me with the overall shape of the build, and it leaves all the smaller details just up to me. On this build, I tried to go for a bit of a different style than I usually go for. I've been trying to practice my gradients recently. I've been fairly afraid to use gradients in the past, so I decided on this build I wanted to practice them a bit. This is also why I kept the shape a bit more simply than I usually would, because I'm trying to let the change in colors carry more of the detail than the shape usually would in my builds. I did a grayish gradient for the body, going from deep slate all the way to diorite. I had the blocks arranged so that generally the darker blocks would be towards the bottom and the lighter blocks would be towards the top. I did add more of the darker blocks around the arches than usual though. This is because there would be more shadows around the underside of the arch, so I kept the darker blocks towards there to make it look a bit better. I decided to put a few larger trees in the background. The trees would hopefully direct a bit more of the attention towards the arches. They would also provide a bit more of a background. I find that a lot of the times, gray builds tend to blend in a bit more with the terrain, especially in my style when a lot of the terraining is done in stone. For the trees though, I tried to use a brownish gradient. I again put the darker blocks where the shadows would be, more on the underside of the trunk and towards the tips of the branches. I darkened the tips of the branches because they're going to be closest to the leaves. The leaves provide a lot of shadow for the tree, so it would look off to have all the lighter blocks up by the top once we add the leaves. I like using world edit brushes to place the leaves for my trees. I like to make the brushes a mixture of both leaves and air. It's important to add the air in there because it gives the trees a more poofy feel. On this build though, because the branches go over the arch, I decided to make the brush a larger percentage of air than leaves. This stops giant clumps of leaves from casting a giant shadow over the top of the build, and it just makes the whole thing a bit easier to see. For the terrain, I did struggle a bit. That's because the server I built on was having a few troubles when I first started the build, so this is actually my single player world. In my single player world though, I am missing a lot of the plugins I usually use for terrain. I started doing it how I used to do it with sand spheres, but I didn't like how it was working, and the server was working again by the time I got to this point. So I went into the server, finished up the terrain, and brought it back here. I unfortunately though forgot to record this part, so you're just gonna see it sort of appear in a bit. And finally, the last step was to add a few more smaller trees. These smaller trees are really important because they help to frame the build on the sides and direct your attention more inwards. Plus, adding any sort of plants to your area always helps to cover up any mistakes that you made when you were making the terrain. I've always struggled a little bit with colors, and I've been seeing builders doing a lot of different stuff recently with a ton of crazy different color combinations that I just haven't seen before. I thought this was good practice to help me get into that style, which I'm going to hopefully try later. If you have any suggestions for that, let me know in the comments below. But that's all the time I have for today. See ya.